right, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could take a seat. Welcome to the David Ramsey Map Center. My name is Salim Mohammed. I'm head and curator of the center. 3 years ago today, after nearly a week of opening celebrations and talks, we began as a fully functional map center with its stellar cartographic collections and its signature digital technologies. That day was April 25th, 2016. In the last 3 years, the center has had a remarkable journey. We've had over 5,000 visitors, partnered with faculty to help teach over 70 classes, hosted 40 events, and conducted 87 tours. The center has helped organize and host 3 interdisciplinary conferences and 2 symposiums. We also had 5 exhibitions, along with a digital companion for several of those exhibitions. In all of this, the common thread has been to push the cartographic envelope, as it were, having its collections and technologies engage with a multitude of disciplines with each of Stanford's schools. As you might imagine, we've had lots of engagement with the history faculty and students, but what is remarkable is how the center has garnered the attention of a variety of other disciplines such as archaeology, art, classics, design, digital humanities, English and English literature, French, Latin American studies, media studies, political science, security studies, theater, urban studies, and writing. Aside from these classes of the center, we've had a multitude of talks, pop-up exhibits, and digital launches. Prominent among them are the Lawrence Eitner Lecture by the Classics Department, astronaut Ed Lu's talk on mapping the near-Earth asteroids, and exhibiting the 66-foot-long Theodore Judah map as part of this year's sesquicentennial celebrations of the Transcontinental Railroad. We have 2 ongoing partnerships. We host every other year in October the Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography. This year, the focus is on the intersection of gender, sexuality, and cartography. We also partner with the California Map Society to bring a prominent speaker every year and administer a student essay competition aside from hosting their meetings every other year. Maps, by their very nature, are interdisciplinary and help coalesce information from several sources. They act as catalysts for dialogue, which brings us to today's event. For today's symposium and exhibition entitled Coordinates, Maps and Art Exploring Shared Terrain, we are bringing together artists in conversation with academics and each other. Both the symposium and the exhibition are pioneering in a myriad of ways. They pair the center's cartographic works with the works of art borrowed from across the country, allowing for a full day of active engagement between the curators, our other speakers, and with the pieces on display in the exhibition. These interchanges, we hope, are going to be distinctive as they are not only displayed physically, but are leveraged by the center's technology. The diverse nature of the pieces exhibited is of import. Landscape pieces, photographs, children's conceptions of maps, views from space, balloon tunnels paired with maps, all of this defy definition. Therein lies the crux of this exhibition, the opportunity for the viewer to ponder new visions in his or her mind about both the map and the art piece, and to liberate preconceived notions about what either is. There will be pairings in this exhibition that will orchestrate epiphanies in your mind, Others you might find pique your curiosity or simply strike you as tastefully eccentric. This, as you might imagine, is infinitely fine. We each have our own favorites, and then there are those that we relegate to the farthest reaches of our mind. The pairing that struck a special chord in my being has to be Andrew Ward's Sofas of LA paired with a couple of choropleth maps. This is the pairing over in the center set of cases over there. It's also on our screen right now. The seemingly pedestrian images of sofas on the street, sandwiched between Richard Saul Wurman's maps depicting personal income and the density of housing, bring to life the cogent reality of the urban landscape. The sofas move from the curb to the corners of the living room and then back to the curb in a seemingly endless and battered life, completely antithetical to the utility of providing cushion to the creatures that it comforts. The map, too, has this dual quality. Prosaic circles of varying intensity, aggregating families of similar income in one case, and that of crowded clusters of humanity in the other. Symbols akin to circular farms, they highlight both the plight and pluck of humanity. Another striking pairing, incidentally, also has to do with the urban American West. I'm referring here to Kim Dingle's piece titled United Shapes of America, Maps Drawn from Memory by Las Vegas Teenagers, and its pairing with 6 marvelous exemplars of children's maps, all girls from the center's collections. You'll find this pairing between the 2 vitrine cases downstairs on the wall near the staircase entrance. We also have it up here on the screen. The Dingle piece is a contemporary work that provides an extraordinary window into the perceived shape of the United States in the mind of a group of Las Vegas teenagers. It is in stark contrast to the fastidious and artistic penmanship of girls drawing maps between 1819 and 1850. In particular, Frances Henshaw's remarkable drawings and text of many US states, a rare and singular copy, and the equally remarkable maps and artistic descriptions by Harriet Baker are monumental pieces in their own right. Paired with the Dingle work, we are left to contemplate how thinking about space has changed over the centuries. Your own experience will be undoubtedly different from mine. I've had the fortune of seeing these pieces early and often, mounted digitally and then physically, transporting me from the ordinary to the multidimensional to the ethereal. You might realize, as did I, that maps or art are not exclusively one or the other. They are interspersed and forever bound. So this actually concludes my introduction to the day. We will now move on to our first set of conversations, beginning with the curators, Emily Prince and David Ramsey speaking with Jordan Stein. First, a few words about each of our speakers. Emily Prince is the cartographic metadata librarian at Stanford. In a former life, she was an artist. She studied studio art here at Stanford and then received her MFA from UC Berkeley, where she was classmates with one of the artists in this exhibition. Bill Jenkins is the artist, and then she also worked under the mentorship of artist Trevor Paglin. Emily has shown her work at such venues as the Venice Biennale of 2007, the Drawing Center in New York, and the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Next, David Ramsey. David Ramsey is a collector, author, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. David was an early and pioneering spokesperson and practitioner of innovative geospatial technologies and visualization that grant global scholarly access to his very large collection of maps, atlases, globes, school geographies, and maritime charts. His remarkable combination of curatorial and technical expertise benefited many libraries, foundations, companies, and organizations, and he was honored by numerous prestigious awards and appointments. His donation of the David Ramsey Map Collection is the greatest benefice in the Stanford Library's history and forms the nucleus of the collections in the David Ramsey Map Center in Green Library. Finally, Jordan Stein. Jordan Stein is a curator and writer based in San Francisco. He has organized exhibitions at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, Frankel Gallery, Artist Space in New York, Matthew Marks Gallery, also in New York, and the Renaissance Society, Chicago. He is a co-founder of the interdisciplinary collaborative group Will Brown, which realized over 36 exhibitions and programs in their Mission District storefront from 2012 to 2015 before working parasitically with other organizations. He founded Cushion Works, a just-in-time gallery on the second floor of an active cushion-making workshop in 2017. He has recently published on both Bruce Corner and hippie-era classified ads. Upcoming projects include flooding San Francisco City Hall with children's art and a book on Jay DeFeo. Without further ado, Emily Prince, David Rumsey, and Jordan Stein.
I turned it on. Okay.
Live? Hello.
Hello.
I'm here, right?
We're here. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Get loose. Today's very much about you and about a multiplicity of voices and experiences, so we're very glad that you're here. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Salim and Map Center. Of course, these genius curators who put together this exhibition. In my field of vision, which is sometimes all too limited to the field of contemporary art, I've never known of a display of artifacts and works quite like this. That is to say, over the course of the last 50 or 100 years, there have been a number of shows in art museums and galleries that concern maps or navigating space in some way, but often they're relegated to incorporating artwork that somehow is a little bit mappy, and the experience can therefore be somewhat thin or surface level. But generally, artworks don't find their way into spaces like this, and similarly, beautiful antiquarian or even contemporary maps hardly ever find their way into great art centers of the world. So this is new. I think this is new. I think this is very novel, and I think in folks here hearing about who you are, where you came from, in your biographies, it makes good sense that this would be a sort of organic, interdisciplinary, break some rules kind of situation. So I guess maybe just to kick things off today, you know, how did this happen? How did we end up here? This show didn't need to be here, and yet it's fantastic that it is here.
We're very glad it's here and hung.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, we actually looked early on at some of the things you mentioned, the 3 or 4 earlier exhibits of, we call them mappish art. One at the Center for Creative Photography, one at MoMA in '99, another here in San Francisco at the SF Art Institute. And we liked them a great deal, but we found that the curatorial impulse there was more to talk about the cartographic aspects of these works. And we then pretty much right away decided that rather than doing that, we wanted to pair an artwork and a map work that could talk to each other in some intelligent way. So that's what you see in this room, and downstairs, 21 pairings that we did. The pairings also work in constellations, particularly in this window here with the Cristo and the Solway and the Ed Ruche and the Mexican Boundary Survey. They cross over from pairs to other pairs. But I think our chief idea was to keep the instruction level low, to give you, you'll see in the catalogs, which are free, and we urge you to take them, give you minimal guidance, just enough of a map for you to navigate around these pairs, but to let you draw your own conclusions and thoughts. Emily, why don't you say
Sure.
how you, I mean, we sort of approached it together, but you all obviously have your own view on how this happened too.
Right. So I would say that the show is, of course, maps and arts juxtaposed together. It's really all about looking. Maps and art are both visual mediums. They speak to us through our sense of vision, and the transcendent ones speak to us not just through vision, but about vision. So they provoke questions like, what is in the frame? What is excluded? Through which lens is the image taken? By whom, or by who, for whom, and for what purpose? And so these works that we chose stimulated that experience for us. But I would say that in addition to that, in addition to those meta questions, each pairing embodies an inquiry between the map and the art that is kindred. And while you'll see that there are aesthetic resemblances in each pair, the thing that we were the most excited about is really the conceptual cross currents beneath those surfaces. And so that is where we both have a tendency to eschew the literal and look for the conceptual.
I think that's right, and that reflects the kind of art that we chose. It's largely art that has a notion of concept, space, and so on. I think for me, one of the great surprises was how artistic the maps are. I was amazed, beyond just the cartouche, the more obvious elements of what a map maker uses, the actual way that so much of this supposedly objective space, like in the Fremont over there that I always have liked, and I'll just go into a little slide of it here. This Fremont map from 1845 is paired with a conceptual photograph by John Fall of the Triangle Bermuda. The Fremont, I was saying to Emily yesterday, and she liked this, is really a conceptual map of sorts, because he's only showing what he saw as he traveled. And he leaves out an enormous amount of area, particularly the Great Basin with the big arching message on it that he doesn't know much about the Great Basin. So I was just amazed at how much the maps were illuminated and very much equal partners in this whole exhibit.
Yeah, and I would like to say to that also zooming out, I think it's valuable to consider our context. Here we are at Stanford, and so what is it to bring art into a research library? So to my understanding, the spirit of academics is one of collective inquiry. And so we encourage you to approach the show with an inquiry-based mindset, meaning that the experience is not intended to be about settling on any particular answers, but rather to ask questions together even, and that is what we're celebrating here at the symposium today. And if there is one little takeaway, it's that we don't want to tell you what to think in any of these cases, and we've intentionally tried to not be didactic in our writing about the pieces, but we hope that you'll walk away absorbing that a map is merely an interpretive guide. It is never just the terrain itself, because it contains the slipperiness inherent to any creative gesture.
Yeah.
And I know you guys want to get into some specific pairings to talk about the relationships, complicated relationships. Right before we do that, I wonder if you guys could reflect for a moment on why the act of pairing was so fundamental to not only the physical exhibition, but to this wonderful catalog. I'm not sure all of you had a chance to pick up at the front. That really is sort of a one-to-one between maps and art, and creates really striking relationships and juxtapositions. How did that emerge very early in the process?
Very much so. Yeah, I think right from the beginning. Well, we looked at the catalogs. We went to SF MoMA Art Library, where David Sr., who I think is here,
He's on
works.
his way.
He's on his way. He'll be up after lunch. And right from the beginning, we felt that the pairings, I don't know how we quite
There's
got
a
to it.
story,
Do
I
you
remember.
Okay.
Yeah, well, David and I were approached by some very nice local artists who wanted to do an artist in residency program
Oh, that's
here.
right.
And David and I got very excited about the idea, but the message that we got, understandably, was that that was too much overhead. So what could we do that didn't require so much? And I thought, what about an exhibition? We just bring in art one time, a one-time thing.
Right.
And so we had the idea to invite artists and ask them to choose a map within our collection, because we thought we wanted them to engage with the collection. And then I think this is where we come in as artists. We got so into making the pairs ourselves that we just wanted to do that part of it.
Although I will say the first art that we actually had the commitment from was from the wonderful John Fall, who lives in Buffalo, New York, and is actually an old friend of somebody I did art practice with a long time ago. But he was so excited about the concept. He's the first person we called. Said, will you lend to the show? And he said, absolutely. Just tell me, where do I send it? And it wasn't quite that easy with everybody else, but he said, what are you pairing it with? And we sent him an image of the Fremont, and he just thought it was fantastic. So that increased our courage, and we plowed ahead.
Maybe we should just jump right into this pairing then.
We'll go to, so Emily, you can
Okay,
talk
so
about Ankawara.
this is one of my favorite artists of all time. This is Ankawara, a Japanese artist who spent much of his life living in Manhattan. He did this series of drawings called I Went, and we'll have the book with the reproductions in our pop-up exhibit today from 1 to 1:30, by the way. So David has whimsically paired these dates. This is April 1st, 1969, with April 1st, 1901, this weather map. So Ankawara created these maps over a decade, where he would draw a map. He would, draw a red line tracing his route. It's just right there. It's so subtle. On a black and white photocopied map every day where he went. If he didn't leave the house, it was just a red dot at his home location. And he would also do the drawings when he would travel to other cities, like Rio de Janeiro, for instance. And then this series, this atlas of weather maps, goes over the course of 180 days in 1901, showing weather across the country. So here's a case where we have this aesthetic resemblance, the visual rhyming with the red line of the weather and the red line of Ankawara's path. And yet what's more interesting to me is the other questions that these pieces both raise, like what does it amount to when you do this kind of epic seriality? Because Ankawara made 4,740 drawings over that over 10-year period. And is repetition such a thing? And does it really just reveal the singularity? And same with the weather. So you see, like, it never repeats exactly over 6 months. They're all unique.
And we have multiple examples of, I think there's 4 or 5 of the Ankawara and 3 of the weather in that case under the silhouette. So you can see get a sense of the sequence.
There are many things that are extraordinary, of course, about Ankawara's practice. One from this series in particular is that it seems, at first blush, to be completely devoid of any personality, emotionality, history, even. I mean, he went there, but it's so remarkably impersonal. Over time, however, in the sort of atlas he compiled, it's just about the most personal document you could ever imagine of somebody's life. So I wonder then, because we're used to thinking about art in those terms, that it's from the guts of the artist and embodies their radical subjectivities and things. But of course, you guys spend a whole lot of time with maps and are thinking about the people who made the maps and how they studied and where they studied and how they choose to communicate information. Before we go to the next pairing, and maybe with this one in mind, you just talk about how you sort of evaluate a human register in evaluating and examining, collecting, sharing maps?
Well, I've always loved to get maps that I can get multiple editions of, particularly the work of Aaron Arrowsmith, who is a British map maker from around 1795 up to until he died, and then his sons took over the business. But I'll have maps of Arrowsmith through multiple editions, with just slight changes. He put out a whole new edition. So he was perhaps on Kawara's spiritual predecessor. But there's that whole thing of maps modifying themselves over time in response to new information. So it has in the case of Arrowsmith, explorers were relying on his maps. Lewis and Clark used his map of North America when they went over the Rockies. And so he was hugely influential. But that's one way I see that kind of change. Emily, how do you see that?
Just like you said, David?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's, we're so close to maps here. We're in and out of them every day, all the time, that sometimes we sort of forget how amazing they are. And I think that's one very sweet thing for us in doing this exhibit, is that it's bringing out things in the maps that we really hadn't realized.
Yeah. It's a real treat for folks like me who I barely find myself in rooms like this. I don't know what the demographic of our crowd here is like, but anyway, should we segue to the next pairing?
Sure. So the next pairing is coming off of this case here, which you're quite close to, so you almost don't need the images. But this is Ed Ruscha's Every Building on Sunset Strip, 1966. A book I remember buying back in the 60s, probably for $10. It's now hugely collectible and rare. This is the art library's copy here that we have laid out. So it's 25 feet long, and it's both sides of the street with the other side of the street upside down. So Ruscha, this is the whole thing as photographed in the studio here. And we paired it with a 65-foot long map in 15 sections by Joseph Solway from 1811. It's the road along Hyde Park, heading east along Hyde Park, or west along Hyde Park. And they both are unusual in their representations of space. It's sort of early Google Maps, but completely different. So going in a little close to the Solway, you see on the top is a front plan view, and at the bottom is a planimetric top-down view of exactly the same space. So it creates this kind of hyperspace where you're looking at the buildings, then you're looking at the buildings from top down along the road. Ruscha does it differently. He's showing you one side of the street, and then the other side of the street is upside down, which again creates a very interesting and different kind of space. Their motivations were entirely different. Ruscha was an early adopter of art books and making them inexpensive for graduate students like myself to buy. And Solway was working for the Turnpike Trust, which was a private entity that had tolls and ran many of the roads in London. But they both sort of converse in interesting ways, and we think definitely have some shared terrain in many different kinds of aspects. So shall I go on to, here's another pairing for Emily,
Okay.
one of your favorites.
Yeah, another favorite artist of mine. So delighted that we were able to bring him into the library. This is Felix Gonzalez Taurus, one of his stack pieces. This is Untitled 1992, 1993. It's downstairs, and I should make it really clear that you are allowed to take a piece with you, and we've paired it with this Menard map that shows worldwide emigration in 1858. And so what excites me about these two pieces together is that they're both so much about movement, dislocation, dispersal, dissemination. And not only is there a commonality between these two works, but I think that there's a very critical commonality between this FGT piece and our ethos as librarians, because his piece is so radical in that it undermines the elitism of art as something that is locked in a box that you can't touch. This you get to take away with you, and that is our very ethos as librarians. We're all about sharing. So it seems like a perfect fit here to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, it just, it makes me wonder, there are lots of ways to present art or artifacts or ephemera. You guys have really created a great challenge for yourself in wanting to show the real thing, right? It's extraordinary that there is a Felix Gonzalez Taurus stack downstairs, and that you've worked with the foundation and been in touch with the museum that owns that piece, and there's a Taube Auerbach painting over there. I mean, at what point did you decide that this shouldn't just be a collection of screens with representations of stuff, but with the stuff?
That's a loaded question, because he's the one who helped us. Jordan came over to where Emily and I were working at my house in San Francisco, and it was our first tryout of the idea, really. You were the guinea pig. And we said, well, we had everything digital at that point, and we had sort of thought we might go with digital. And Jordan said, well, that'll make a nice study exhibit. And then we just deflated, we want to do more than that. He said, well, then you have to get the real stuff. And actually, John Fall, when he had encouraged us about the Fremont Map, he had said, you're going to use the original, right? You have the original. And I said, well, we think so, but we haven't completely gotten there yet. See, part of our early idea of the digital was that we could make everything the same size. We were sort of interested in making everything the same size. And then we realized, no, that's fine, because you can do that on this screen, you can do it on this screen. We do it in the catalog, but it's very important to have the actual materiality of these objects up. So Jordan helped us switch, and then of course we realized we wish we had started a year earlier, because poor people like Lisa Lefebvre at Holt Smithson were so helpful to us, but we were always saying, we're just about at the drop dead date. And anyway, so thank you, Jordan, that helped.
It took several months off your life. But I mean, what do you think? Because I saw it for the first time this morning. You guys have been installing for a week or two. I mean, what do you think? How do you feel about having all this, having Ed Ruscha's beautiful book alongside this original extraordinary map in here, and how does it compare to other efforts that have happened, in this room? How does it feel different or similar?
It's exciting to see the art in this context. I was honestly a little bit nervous about it the whole time. Like, this is not an art space, and what is it going to be? Are these works going to feel squashed in our little cases? But then once we started to install it with the help of our amazing Deirdre, who worked tirelessly, thanks Deirdre, when she began to install, I was like, oh, this is actually cool to see these things in this so recontextualized with the vocabulary of a library. And then I felt like it was a little bit of a coup to bring these works of art into the library.
And it was unusual for the library, because the library is used to lending things, not borrowing things. I mean, Special Collections does borrow books, but that's a pretty well-greased machine of lending between libraries. So this was something new to the library, but they supported us, and Salim was fantastic getting our various documentation that we needed and so on. So anyway, these are all the practical things, but we did lay out the entire exhibit in scale. We are map people, so the whole thing was laid out so that we saw how the Auerbach had to, Emily is good friends with Tauba, and Tauba was wonderful lending the piece, but we knew right away, we'd say, well, it has to be these dimensions, Tauba, because we don't have just walls, we have cases, and so that was interesting to go through.
Yeah, we had to pivot a lot.
Yeah.
I'm getting a signal here that we should switch to Q&A time for a few minutes. So, any of you guys have any questions? I'd invite you to speak up. I think we have 5 minutes or so.
Just a comment, David.
Yeah.
This idea of the digital and real, I'll call it, calls to mind the exhibit you had last year, the miniatures. To be able to see magnificent detail on the screen, but then to go to the back of the room and see the real object. And to be able to compare the emotional impact between the two. It seems like this is one of the core ideas of this center, is to be able to show the actual, most often the actual cartographic plot, but also this magnificent visual representation, digital representation on the screen.
So just for those of you who couldn't hear in the back, it's Fred who was saying that he's pleased that we have a digital and physical component to the show. And actually here we've added a printed catalog, which is yet another instantiation of the show. Actually quite a different instantiation of the show that will last much longer than the show itself. But as Salim said, our motto is both and here, both the physical and the digital. We're very sensitive also not to let the digital overwhelm the physical. That's something you have to be careful of, because digital is very seductive. But generally speaking, I think if you handle the digital well, it simply enhances your love and appreciation of the physical object. That seems to be what has happened in this library. Is the more we put things out on the web, the more visitors we have coming wanting to see the originals and the digitals as well. Any other questions, thoughts, observations? Yes.
I'm curious whether you started the process by thinking about maps or art. Did you have a particular feeling about your collection from a map perspective and then look for the art compare, or did you go the other way?
To my memory, it usually went from the trajectory of art that is related to space. So, of course, you'll see many instances of earthworks, land art, off-site experimentation. Like, for instance, the Richard Long documentation of one of his walks over here. So we looked at what art is out there that has related themes to cartography, very macro speaking, and then what map, and that was one of the reasons why this show is possible, is the very wealth of David's collection. And also, we had to pivot so many times that there was always something else that we could find to place with it.
That's my recollection too. In one sense, we couldn't start with the maps because there's too many. We wouldn't know where to begin. And the art gave it, thinking about art, sort of pulled it into categories and gave it a kind of intellectual shape that really helped.
Grounded it.
Yes, yeah. Yes. I'll repeat it.
I'm curious about is there any emerging vocabulary around the crossover between the two disciplines? You're seeing it or describing
Yeah, I don't believe in binaries, so I'd say definitely. Crossover, overlay, overlap.
Yeah,
integration.
there's 3 essays in the catalog. Emily and I wrote one with great help from Abby Rumsey as our catalog editor. And I think there we talk quite a bit about a language, terms that are useful, that are helpful to understand how you cross over from these 2 things.
And unfortunately, we have to wrap up now, but I'll just say real briefly, too, that I think if a vocabulary, may arise today, I think it's going to happen in rooms like this. I think most of the time interdisciplinary studies originate from without rather than within. People who run museums who think that that's a really terrific idea, but don't necessarily know anything about it. And I think that this room knows something about it. So I think we'll see if we can figure something out today. Anyway, but thank you, Emily and David, for that. And
Thanks, Jordan.
say what?
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jordan, for a most illuminating discussion. We now move on to our second set of conversations. This one between Abby Smith Ramsey and Joshua Jelly-Schapiro. A few words about them. First, Abby Smith Ramsey. Abby Smith Ramsey is a historian of ideas. She is the author of When We Are No More, How Digital Memory is Shaping Our Future. She focuses on the nature of evidence, the changing roles of libraries and archives, and how information technologies shape perceptions of the past. A former Fulbright Fellow, she received her PhD in Russian history from Harvard. She has worked at the Library of Congress, served as Director of Programs at the Council on Library Information Resources, and was Director of the Scholarly Communications Institute at the University of Virginia. Next, Joshua Jelly-Schapiro. He is Scholar in Residence at the Institute of Public Knowledge, New York University. Joshua also teaches at NYU. He's a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and also writes for the New Yorker, Harper's, and other publications. He's the author of Island People, The Caribbean and the World, and the co-editor with Rebecca Solnit of Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas. Without further ado, Abby Smith Ramsey and Joshua Jelly-Schapiro. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Salim, and thank you all for coming out today. And special thanks to Joshua, who flew in from New York last night.
True, landed not so many hours ago.
That's right, exactly. So I'm glad that we can catch you before jet lag really kicks in, especially after a meal. So well.
I got a couple cups of coffee in me. I'm good to go.
Good. So Josh, besides all the wonderful books that you published, you're also, fundamentally, I think, by training, a geographer. And I want to explore what that is a little bit, ask you about it. But these 2 questions that were posed just now, one about the emotional resonance of seeing the digital and the artifactual together, and also the question about an emerging vocabulary, a crossover vocabulary between art and maps, seems to me 2 questions that are perfect lead-ins to my question to you. What is a geographer? And what do you bring to this view of the world?
Yes, well, first I just say I'm thrilled to be here. It's really a thrilling exhibition. I was really excited to learn that it was happening, and goes to the core of a lot of things that I'm excited about and most interested about. So really pleased to be here. That question is a question, as you can imagine, I think I got a lot sort of starting around the time I enrolled in a PhD program in geography. And people said, what the heck is that? What does one do with a PhD in geography? What even is that? And I can say first off that, many of us, geography sort of ends in 5th grade, right, when we learn our state capitals. Elsewhere in the world, that's not the case, right? Geography is a thriving discipline many places sort of outside the United States. And here it certainly is, but there are only, a dozen odd actual sort of graduate schools that give degrees in geography now. That's a kind of interesting and strange history that's partly to do with the fact that back in the day when everyone sort of followed Harvard's lead and Harvard got rid of a geography department back in the Depression or sometime like that, everyone got rid of theirs. But in any case, the way that I sort of think about geography, and I really fell into it is the honest answer. I was interested in writing about the world, about place, about cultures, about history, but I was in Berkeley and sort of happy to be there, and there's a marvelous geography program there, and so I really fell into it. But in essence, I think that what geographers do is think about place and space in a whole range of ways. But for me, and I'm really, I think, as sort of humanities as it gets on the sort of spectrum of geographers, that I think about place and how and why it matters to human beings. How and why a sense of place is fundamental to figuring out who we are, who we want to be, how we constitute our societies, how we think about the past. And so place is really fundamental to everything I do. It's essential to my writing, it's essential to these maps I've been working on making. And for me, one thing that I can say about, apropos of what we're thinking about and talking about today, are the ways in which place and a sense of place is always about story, right? It's always about the stories we tell about places, both how they came to be and what they are, what constitutes them. And so I think that that's one way to sort of approach all of the pairs in here, is to think about not merely the kind of agendas or sort of worldviews that they distill, but what are the narratives that both their makers sort of infuse them with and that we can take from them, and what new narratives emerge from the sort of pairs that are here.
So let's talk about one of the pairs that you want to talk about. David, if we can have the first slide. What strikes me about some of the things that we've talked about is your interest in borders and lines. And in fact, you're working on a piece about borders and lines. So would you say something about borders and lines for us?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. Of course, borders and the ways in which we mark them are really central in our national conversation right now in all kinds of new and perhaps worrying ways. But borders for a very long time, right, have been the sort of sites par excellence where the lines inscribed on a map are made real or attempted to be made real. And there's a sort of long and convoluted and fascinating history about how and why that's happened in different places throughout the world. It's instructive, right, that the two barriers we think of as sort of emblematic of border walls from the ancient world, the Great Wall of China and Hadrian's Wall namely, those walls are not, at all sort of constitutive of what we think of as national border walls today, which is to say sort of describing a national territory that people are not meant to cross. That's not what they were, because nation states didn't exist in that way at that time. But what we have, right, and the way in which I love sort of thinking about the Christo piece and this piece, the sort of US-Mexico border survey map, right, this is from 1901, but is a sort of map of the recharting of the border that originally happened, right, in the wake of the war in 1848, is this sort of effort to inscribe and sort of make a line in the sand, as it were, that sort of makes this imaginary thing, a nation state, real, right? And what's fascinating, I think, about the story of the border survey, those of you who are familiar with it, is that, it is these sort of two teams, a team of American surveyors and cartographers, a team of Mexican surveyors, who sort of worked in concert in the desert, in a part of the continent that was thought of as essentially worthless, that it was unthinkable that anyone would want to sort of spend time in this part of the world or this part of the country. And of course, what we've seen since is that the border created a kind of world of connection, that there are all these towns there that actually wouldn't exist if the border weren't there. But I think that what the Christo piece, right, speaks to, and it's fascinating to think about how it would have resonated in 1976 versus today, because I think we look at it now, right, and we think, oh, it's a border wall, right? It's actually quite interesting to think about how it would have looked then, because this sort of dream, this sort of quixotic and strange dream, really, of making concrete a line that is a sort of imagined thing, is a relatively new thing. But it's fascinating because, of course, this is also a kind of ephemeral line, which is much more in keeping, I would say, with what the border actually is, right?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that very much. I mean, I am familiar with this territory now in Marin and Sonoma, and the last thing I would think of is erecting some kind of a boundary there. I mean, that's not just a Californian saying that. That's the nature of the landscape. And now that you mention it, I realize I, by default, think that, of course, there's a border in Texas or wherever between, Mexico and the United States, but for a long time, it would have been inconceivable that there would be these surveyors there trying to carve up the land. So it's an interesting way to think about how can we not just build borders, but also build them so that they can be easily disassembled.
Right.
And they were these, Christo and Jean-Claude had to negotiate with, think about the number of people whose property this crossed that they had to negotiate with, and how sensitive people in California are to impingements on their environment. And so to think that they were able to bring this off as a work of art, as a kind of demonstration of the fact that borders can be erected and taken down is really, it's quite extraordinary, and also speaks very much to a time. So let me also lead on to the next question, which is about all the work that you've done in building an atlas with Rebecca Solnit about part of a trilogy of the atlases that the two Rebeccas, Solnit and Snedeker, and Josh did on 3 cities. The first was in San Francisco, Infinite City. The second is Unfathomable City, which is New Orleans, and then Nonstop Metropolis, which is New York. And thinking about how the task was to use art and cartography and narrative, poetry and narrative, to talk about place as an idea, as a set of emotions, as a set of human experiences, demarcating that. And there are lots of pieces in the show that, now that I'm thinking about this in conversation with you, also speak very much to what experience means and how it relates to a place. So if we could look at the next slide, David. This seems to be a real favorite. I mean, it looks to me like cows, and I later read that, in fact, Kim Dingle said, this looks like cows, so.
I'm seeing elephants, I'm seeing all kinds of stuff with that.
But this is the Kim Dingle piece, just so you know, it's downstairs, and if you walk out of the center and turn directly to get to the bottom of the stairs and turn directly to the right, you cannot miss it. It's paired with, as Salim said, other images done by girls in school in the 1800s, when geography was a required subject, and was the way that girls learned penmanship, among many other things. Which, incidentally, I understand from spending so much time with David and seeing some of these, which was a way that women in New England who would never travel outside of their sphere, certainly not alone. These girls were young, and their teachers allowed them to explore the world in their imagination and to think about places that they would never go in real life. And so the making of maps, the thinking about space, gave them a zone of freedom in their lives that they were never entitled to in real life. Now that's not true, thank goodness, anymore. But in comparison with the way kids in Las Vegas think about this, what do you think and feel when you see how kids remember the shape of the U.S.?
Yes, well, one thing I think of immediately when I sort of saw this wonderful piece is, again, to sort of connect it to the border survey, that the first time that people, Americans sort of saw this shape, or a more precise version of this shape, was in the wake of the original U.S.-Mexico border survey in the 1850s, late 1850s, when William Emery and the people who published the sort of first maps of essentially this shape, And the sort of rhetorical force and authority and sort of historical weight that was bound up in that map, which was circulated all over the country, and sort of depicted this thing, this continental nation that extends to the Pacific and has this shape, was immensely sort of powerful in shaping Americans' conception of this as a sort of contiguous nation. And it goes to the sort of history of maps as bound up in the history of states, That, as historians of cartography know, 90+% of the maps that we recognize as such, date from sort of the 16th century on, which is to say the sort of Westphalian moment, the moment when the idea of the nation state as this territorial bounded thing comes to be, And so maps, because they're vested with the kind of authority of science, But at the same time, right, there's a deep tradition of trying to make them aesthetic objects, make them artful, and make them beautiful, are these uniquely powerful instruments, I think, because they can be at once aesthetic and sort of bear the authority of science, right? And for that reason, I think it's marvelous, right, to look at maps in conjunction with art and to think about them, again, as sort of art objects, right? Because I think you mentioned the Atlas series that I've been really privileged to work on with Rebecca Solman and Rebecca Snedeker. And that series really got underway sort of about a decade ago now, and really with the invaluable help of David. And I remember specifically one visit to your basement with the sort of initial Atlas crew.
The library is the basement.
Yeah, exactly. To see many of these maps and many others, but just as a sort of way to get inspired and start thinking about maps. And really, if you cast your mind back to sort of 10 or 12 years ago, that's the moment when we all sort of really, especially in this part of the world, right, started navigating with machines, with these sort of glowing screens that we carry around in our pockets or GPS devices in cars, which of course are incredibly useful in all kinds of ways. But we're also really interested in thinking about if those come to sort of replace paper maps, if there's a kind of impoverishment there, what's lost? What's lost in not having a sort of beautiful paper object that does a lot of things that a sort of geographic navigating device doesn't. One of them, most crucially perhaps, giving broader context, right? It's not just turn left, turn right, go straight. It's, oh, there's this whole world here. I can imagine a story of where I am located in regards to other things. And perhaps then with a good map, right, it sort of lets you enter that story and perhaps highlights things about that place experientially or historically that are not, where to spend money. It's basically what do our map apps do? They say, okay, where do you get gas? Where do you get coffee? Where do you spend money? Essentially, they're a business. And so our idea with the atlases, right, one was to say, okay, what can a beautiful paper map still do that a sort of little screen can't? And what are some of the histories and stories that we can sort of get at with a map when it works well?
So before we're going to actually see some of the maps that Josh has done for this atlas, which is, I think, a preview of the show in many ways because many artists were involved in building these, in creating these maps. But before we do, I want to ask you as a teacher, and what does this imprecise, if poetic, understanding of what the United States look like mean to you as a teacher, and what do you think it means for what we need to do or how we're going to grapple with concepts of space? Now that you've mentioned the digital, and we won't even be looking at paper maps, how are we going to conceive a space, and is there something that you'd like to see your students understand about space and place that you feel may be disadvantaged in the digital world unless teachers like you do something about it?
That's a great question. I mean, one thing I always have my students do, and it's sort of very in keeping with the, with this piece, but also the Atlas projects, is to essentially have them sort of create a map of their own New York, which is where we are, but you could do that anywhere, right? And to say, what is your experience and perception of this place? How might that differ from what Google Maps gives you as sort of what's important and worth looking at here? And I think that essentially it's like reading, right? Learning to read maps critically, though, is the most important thing, whether that's an electronic map or a paper map. And the key sort of insight there is that all maps, right, sort of purport to a kind of authority, or often, in their sort of history as these objects of, state propaganda, essentially sort of propound a vision of the world, right? And learning to read maps critically is absolutely vital. It's important to read books and newspapers critically. It's crucial to read maps critically as well, which is to say, to think in a very basic way, what are the aims and agendas of this map's maker, right? And to say that there is nothing essentially correct about any choice that a map maker makes, right? It could be drawn on facts, absolutely, but that all maps are a sort of accretion of choices, right? And what are the agendas and sort of ideas that they're meant to convey? So thinking critically, I mean, that's our sort of job as educators in general, but I think we don't think about the importance of reading maps critically, but I think it's vital.
Good. We'll take a look at the atlas slides now, David, if you want to. So we're going to look at some of these slides, some of the images. Sorry, I have to turn around to see what's on the screen. But I just want to say, I remember very well when Rebecca Solnit came by with her first group of cartographers and artists and poets to start work on Infinite City, which is San Francisco. And one of the things that surprised everybody, the artists in particular, but did not surprise the cartographers, was the extravagant artistic elements of the maps that they were looking at. And if you look at Infinite City, the maps that were created have so many decorative elements, or they look like decorative elements, which to the, maybe to some people just look old-timey. They've got this old-timey feel about them, but are in fact, when you look, are very elaborate meditations on the art that existed in the maps that these cartographers and artists saw in David's library. And they're really quite extraordinary. And so you can see, even before this kind of dialogue was happening between works of art and maps, that cartographers have always considered the aesthetic elements of a map, maybe to the vexation of the surveyors, but there were always things that had to be marketed in the marketplace. I mean, just like, Google needs to advertise to get people to use their maps, so do cartographers, and the aesthetic qualities of them were paramount in their mind. That's just a little editorial comment. So Josh, what are we looking at?
Absolutely. Do you have, David, do we have any of the Louisiana ones, or do we just have these three? Are these the three that we have? 6. Oh, we have 6. Could you click forward a couple? Or one more? Yeah, cool. Another one? Another one, sorry. We're going in reverse order, in fact.
Sorry.
That's fine, no problem. One more. Yeah, brilliant. Yes, this one. This was the segue one I was thinking of. So this is a map from Unfathomable City, which was the second in the series. It's an atlas of New Orleans, but also an atlas of the sort of larger world and region that New Orleans is the center of, if you like. And this is a map. One thing that we were really interested to do in all the maps we've created is to sort of suggest some of the ways that the maps that we're used to present a set of conventions or assumptions, perhaps, about the world that we can just as easily unsettle if we sort of map it in a different way. One of those sort of assumptions or things that are misleading things that a map of Louisiana often does is that it presents the coastline, right, as sort of totally discrete, that there's water and then there's land. And so one thing we were interested to do, because those of you know Louisiana know that it's extremely low, it's losing land, some horrifying thing like a football field an hour or so. I'm not sure of the statistic, but anyway, it's this very porous landscape. And so what we wanted to do here, right, was to present that sort of truth and say this is actually much more porous than we think. And also that the sea is not just water, right? In this part of the world, it's this deeply industrialized landscape that's sort of cross-cut with oil pipelines and all kinds of infrastructure. This is also not long after the BP oil spill, so one of these dots is that oil rig that exploded. And then the birds, right, speaking of the aesthetic, it's a sort of comment on the sort of environmental damage of the oil spill, but we commissioned an artist to just do these beautiful birds and make it beautiful, I hope. So that's the idea there. Could go back one. This is a map from the New York Atlas, from Unfathomable, Nonstop Metropolis. And this is a map. In most of our atlases, we've been, and this was Rebecca's thing from the start. She said, I actually want these to be geographically correct, in a sense, to have, so that people could actually sort of use them and interact with them in a way that they're used to. This map, as you'll notice, is not at all geographically correct. This is a totally sort of imaginative cartography exercise. But the idea that we're playing with here is essentially to, as you see, it's a mashup of the islands of the Caribbean and the islands of New York with some sort of art elements from a beautiful map in David's collection. But the idea here was twofold. Essentially, we wanted to present a cartographic lie that told the truth. That was the idea. And the two truths that we're sort of getting at here is One, that New York is a deeply Caribbean city, which is something I care about. I write about the Caribbean a lot, but it's a place where upwards of 2 million people have roots in this part of the world, in the West Indies, and has been historically linked to the islands through the slave trade and otherwise for centuries. And its culture is deeply Caribbean, right? Things that we think of as New York, like hip hop, right? It sort of comes from Jamaican culture, comes from Puerto Rican culture, et cetera, et cetera. The other idea, though, is that New York, when you think about it, is a city of islands, right? It's an archipelago also. And so we have essentially the only part of New York that's connected to the continent is the Bronx, which is why we've labeled it North America there. But the rest, right, is islands. And there's also all these wonderful little islands that people don't think about with these amazing names, you know, Mau Mau Island and Dead Horse Island and Little Brother and North Brother Island. But that's the idea there. Go to the excellent. And this is essentially, again, from Nonstop Metropolis. And just by way of another example of how we sort of play with cartographic conventions and say, okay, this is how you've seen this part of the world, but how can we sort of flip that and make you see it in a different way? And this one, quite simple really, is essentially to say that in maps of New York, right, New Jersey is always relegated to background. It's like you like put the cartouche on it, you sort of put the scale on it, you know, New Jersey is just worthless essentially is what maps of the city tell you, right? And that's sort of New York myopia and all the rest. But so we wanted and sort of to do two things with this one. One was essentially to say, no, we're gonna highlight New Jersey and sort of relegate New York to the background. But also it's a comment on where the sort of culture of New York and things that are iconic of New York and New York arts in particular, all these figures who we think of as so Manhattan, you know, jazz people to Patti Smith to all sorts of people, right? Where do they come from? It's very much they come from the suburbs. Many of them come from New Jersey. So essentially we do this map of New Jersey's greats, but I also thought it was especially apt here because we have our quote from the great Robert Smithson, hasn't Passaic replaced Rome as the eternal city, which is sort of the guiding idea of this map. We go to the next.
Wait,
Yeah.
before we go, just so those in the back can see, it's titled The Suburban Theory of the Avant-Garde, New Jersey's Greats. And I think, David, you spotted Nancy Holt's birthplace?
Yes, just above Passaic.
Just above Passaic, David's saying.
All right, Clifton.
Oh, yeah, so there's
There
one
she
that
is.
says, yeah, artist Nancy Holt, born 1938, elsewhere raised. And below it says, Robert Smithson creates landmark work monuments of Passaic, 1967. Well, okay. And then there's William Carlos Williams below that, so how avant-garde can you get?
To Sarah Vaughan, to Celia Cruz, to
Count
everyone.
Basie.
There you go, Count Basie,
Yeah.
George Clinton, Thomas Edison. Avant-garde, I don't know, but anyway.
I mean, you can see who the map makers really love. Okay.
This is actually, I'm really excited to share this one. Some of you may have seen this, an earlier version of this. It was sort of the breakout star, if you like, of Nonstop Metropolis. Also really the kind of simplest map in the book. And this was really Rebecca's brilliant brainchild. The idea, as you see, is essentially to take the map that's the most familiar and iconic of New York, which is the subway map, which is a sort of funny and amusing thing to those who care, well, again, about geographic accuracy, because it's totally geographically inaccurate. It's deeply misleading in terms of, you know, Manhattan is huge and it's straight north-south, which it's not. Staten Island's tiny, it's not. There's all these ways in which this is a misleading map, but it is the way in which, right, we get around the city. The subway is incredibly important to the history of New York, that there is this system that's still, and I hope it stays this way, you know, it's still $2.75 to travel from the north end of the Bronx to Coney Island if you want, which has been hugely important to the history of culture and how it circulates in the city. But what we wanted to do, and this was, as I say, Rebecca's idea, but then I had the pleasure of researching it mostly with a couple of, with Garnet Cadigan and Jonathan. We thought it was good that it was all the guys on the team who ended up researching it. She was like, here, you guys go figure this out. But essentially it was to take every subway stop, or nearly every one, and rename it for an illustrious woman. who either was born or grew up in that area or otherwise sort of left her mark or attended school. Abby Smith Rumsey, you'll note, has a stop there. Very, very important. Yeah. Immortalized.
I lived actually on Irving Street, which is the only street at least in Manhattan, named after a writer. So I thought that was pretty good.
There you go, brilliant. But in any case, so this goes and we essentially we had this. We did this 3 years ago, and we did it as a poster, and it's been sort of posted around the city in different ways, and it's had this great sort of life. But of course, what it's trying to do is to make a comment on the ways in which virtually everything in the city is named after a man, right? From Lafayette Street to Washington Square Park to Astor Place to wherever. We live, as Rebecca puts it, in a manscape, right? And so her sort of idea was to say, how does it change our perceptions of place and of history to valorize and celebrate other people who've inhabited these spaces and shaped the city? So that's the sort of basic idea here. And of course, we're in a conversation now, really, in New York and elsewhere about what things are named, about monuments, about all the rest. And so this, I think, really, spoke to that in quite a pointed way. And now New York is actually getting, up until 2 years ago, there are 200 plus public statues in the city that honored specific men, right? Actual sort of historical figures or just random community leaders and doctors. And there were 2 women, not counting the Lady Liberty. We're good at doing statues of sort of imaginary women, but less good at actual ones. So now there's actually a sort of real conversation in the city, and there's a Susan B. Anthony statue that just went up, and a Harriet Tubman that's going up in Harlem. So we're up to like 5 or 6. So it's a long way to go. Yeah, should do. Anyway, so that's the idea here. We also thought it was just really cool to be like, get on the subway at Grace Jones and off at Yoko Ono, and then go out to see the tennis, and Venus Williams is the stop. So anyway, but then we've just updated it because there's this box set of all 3 atlases coming out in the fall that UC Press is doing, which we're really excited about. And so they asked us to do 3 new maps that just kind of updated things. And this one, we just updated it, basically, because it was only a couple of years old, and we had some gaps on it, and there were also new women, and we had to get, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Bronx. We had to get some people that are just like, we can't leave them off. So anyway, this is the sort of edition 2 of City of Women. And then these, I'm just going to show you 2 more. Sorry, I'm going to show you 2 more. These are the 2 maps from New Orleans and San Francisco. They're sort of addendums to those atlases. This map is one that we'd really wanted to do in New Orleans, and for some reason the pieces just didn't come together. But essentially it's a map that celebrates and sort of tells the story of Homer Plessy, right? And the essential, the incredibly historic, case Homer Plessy's Unfinished Ride is what this map is called. And it's essentially about Homer Plessy's arrest, right? Getting on a segregated rail car, and the saga that sort of unfolded from there. But what we wanted to do essentially was to present his sort of journey in the day. So you probably can't see it from back there, but it's basically Homer Plessy, the journey that he took in concert with the kind of organization, the Citizens Committee, that planned and sort of executed his arrest as a way to test segregation laws, right? In juxtaposition with the sort of story of John Ferguson, who's the judge whose name is sort of forever linked to Plessy's as the judge in Louisiana, who essentially upheld the idea that separate but equal was legal, which was not, of course, overturned until 1954. So this was a way essentially to get at a sort of crucial bit of New Orleans history, but to make it vivid, to give it visual form, and to talk about the ways in which we're still dealing with its repercussions now. We can do the last one. And this, finally, is the sort of up-to-date San Francisco map. That atlas now came out almost a decade ago, so it's quite some time. And Rebecca was very clear about what we needed to do in terms of the updating San Francisco, because it's a very different city than it was a decade ago. And so essentially what we did was to partner with this organization of cartographers and urbanists who have been working. It's called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and what they've done, essentially, this remarkable work in compiling data around evictions in San Francisco. And so what you see, the background layer here, the sort of red dots, and Rebecca, I think she's like, I want it to look like a bruise, like the city's been punched up. And so these dots are evictions, right, over the last decade. And then what we have are quotes essentially about the ways in which, I think the guiding question here is sort of, when does a city not sort of lose its sense of self, and how many sort of changes can it undergo, the sort of rapidity of urban change, and the ways in which sort of economic forces can hurt and harm or perhaps improve neighborhoods. But that's the sort of question here, just the incredible transformations that San Francisco's undergone. And these sort of, in a kind of poetical gesture, right, the sort of quotes are essentially just quotes from various people sort of reflecting on the import of tech, the sort of harm of sort of new economies in this part of the world. But she wanted to make them look like little bugs, or sort of give them shape, right? There's a sort of way in which these blocks of text are sort of made to look like little poems. But in any case, that's the last one. And all three of these maps are going to be included as kind of broadsides in the box set version of our atlases. So that's that.
Great, thanks. I also, I mean, I didn't think about this beforehand, nor did Josh, but this map actually is another way of representing what Salim highlighted in his opening talk about the sofas that are on the streets of LA, and the Richard Saul Warman map showing population and economic wherewithal. So this is another way of showing the bruise that cities undertake as things move along. We actually, by some uncanny coincidence, are right at the time when our timer is going to say it's time for Q&A. So we'll take questions, and if you can speak loud, that's great, but I'll be summarizing your questions so you all can hear. Questions for Josh? Yes, Jay.
As a cartographer, I'm in science. I would think one would want to go towards what is real, the truism. And what I see is, even through looking, thanks to David and Abby knowing about maps, the history is really using them as propaganda, using instead of historic measures. But really, I was thinking to myself, there's no regulation that says what I grew up with, where North America and South America were exactly the same size. And that's how we imagined it because of the maps that were printed. So I'm just wondering, is there a conflict for going for the truth and then using it, doing it for other purposes?
So just to summarize, the scientist in the room was asking, he had a presumption that maps actually represented reality, what was true. And he's come to realize this is not the case, that North America and South America are not actually at the same scale, or the same size. So he's asking Josh to opine on the conflict between getting ideas across and strictly factual representation, if there is such a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, one way to say it, the whole history of, and just to take one example, of map projections, right, and the ways in which we have solved the riddle of projecting a round thing onto a flat surface, right, has a whole deep history. And I think it's not by accident, as you sort of suggested just now, that the Mercator projections that we're most used to have sort of skewed things to make us think that, for one thing, Europe's a lot bigger than it is. The Northern Hemisphere's on the top. All these things that are, there's no way to say that that's objectively so, but we have inherited these things from maps. But what I'd say just really sort of briefly about that is that, far be it from me to say that sort of advances in geospatial technology and the incredible precision and tools that we have to sort of pinpoint location and to make more accurate maps in that sense is a bad thing. I wouldn't say that at all. In fact, we use those tools in making our maps. We use a kind of, essentially the base map we borrow from Google, right? Who has an excellent base map. But I would say that it's important, it's just as important now as it was 200-300 years ago when a new kind of, the astrolabe came in or whatever it was, to say this is now we are incredibly accurate, is to say, okay, yes, we're accurate. What do you do with that information? What story do you tell with it? And you can tell a story about here's what we own and here's what you should spend money on, or you can tell a story about here's some people that have been displaced. You know, there's a lot of different stories that one can tell using the best information available, and I think that maps, as I say, always involve choices about what story you want to tell and what you want to highlight.
So depictions of reality are relative in a way. I just want to point out in that case over there, there's a wonderful pairing, a map by, or a piece by Buckminster Fuller and a piece by Agnes Denish, both of which play with the idea of projection. And when we were, when the curators were looking at writing a label for this, they realized that in fact we have to explain to the non-map heads in the room what a projection actually is, because a lot of people are naive readers of maps and don't understand the nature of projections. Questions? More questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, could you just speak louder or stand up? Just to recapitulate, this is a PhD student in interdisciplinary studies who's agog at how wonderful the map trilogy is, and asking, which I agree with, asking how it came about that so many people were addressing a subject that and opens up so many different agendas, from feminist to geological.
Yeah, no, I love speaking to that question. The sort of story is how the first one got underway, as essentially SF MoMA was about to celebrate a 75th anniversary, and essentially asked Rebecca, as she's very much a San Francisco person, lifelong Bay Area, if there was something she was dying to do. And she said, I've always loved maps, I've always wanted to make an atlas of San Francisco. And the first one was very much, she sort of had that idea, but had no idea how to do it or what that would look like, and essentially reached out to a bunch of friends. And I, at the time, was in grad school at Berkeley, and we knew each other slightly, but I was sort of a contributor to that one, along with a dozen of other people. But I think what we found right away, and our collaboration grew, I had a much bigger role in the New Orleans one, and then the New York one we did together, essentially was to say that maps, we just realized we both love maps and think about maps in a similar way, as to say that maps are a way into all these things that you just spoke about, to think about gender, to think about race, to think about history, to think about technology. And so it just became, I think like all good collaborations, it was just super fun. I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do a subway map named for women? Yeah, absolutely, let's do it, And so we were lucky to have sort of support to do it. But I would say, just really quickly too, I would say that I think one thing Rebecca and I have often said about these projects is that because they pair maps with essays, and so there's always a map element and a text element, and both of us work as writers, and I think that in a good story or a good essay, right, it's as much about, again, it's about telling a story, but it's about using the examples that tell that story well, and it's not necessarily about including 10,000 bits of data. It's like, what are the 3, 4, 5, 6 dozen things that tell the story you want to tell, right? And so I think we've brought that same sensibility to the maps, and to say, a good map tells a good story. A good piece of writing, I think, implies a map. And so we've just been really interested in that kind of back and forth.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll note that last time I was in the French Quarter in New Orleans, the number of people who had the atlas to New Orleans in their backpack and actually treated it like it was a Baedeker or Photos or the Moon Planet is really quite extraordinary. So maps and stories definitely go together. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Every 4 years, we're treated to artistic impressions of the political geography of the country. And I'm curious your comments on that challenge. Of course, voter density versus acres of land.
Absolutely. I think about that all the time. The ways in which maps, it's quite similar actually to that history of the ways in which the form of the United States became a kind of thing that people were familiar with 150 years ago. We, as you say, during elections, you turn on a TV and that form is there all the time, right? And with this red and blue convention, which is a sort of wild and received idea that now we just talk about. It's sort of in the parlance. I'm not sure I have anything super profound to say about the fact that we sort of deal with maps in that way, but I think it is just another example of the kind of the authority that's sort of vested in maps to sort of tell us a story about where we are and the sort of society we live in. But that is a deeply misleading story in all kinds of ways. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the sort of maps that people have done about, you look at a map of the 2016 election and it's sort of, there's a lot of red and there's some blue on the coast, right? And so it gives the perception that the sort of red outnumbers the blue, if you like. Of course, if you do a map with population, it looks very different. And people have done that, they've sort of tweaked it so that it's sort of true to population. It looks very different, right? And so I think that is a really potent example of the ways in which a map tells a particular story. I don't think it's by accident that the president actually has he has an election map hanging in the White House that he loves to show visitors and say, look how I kicked ass. And like, well, you lost by 3 million votes, but if that's the story you want to tell. Anyway.
Okay, so no answer, right? However, I do think that we as consumers of information can be more demanding of the people who provide information to us, and there's, through the internet, ways that we can make our voices heard that didn't exist before. So unfortunately, our time is up because I think we could carry on for a long time, but thank you very much, Josh.
Thank you, Abby. Pleasure.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you again, Josh. We are now at the end of the morning's set of talks. We will break for lunch. That's between now and 1 o'clock. There is a pop-up exhibit that David and Emily have put together, and that's at 1 o'clock. But the center will be open throughout the time, so you're welcome to come in anytime and enjoy the fine exhibition that's around you. Thank you.